Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Amin Yazdani, Director of Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance, and the host for today's webinar. We are looking at work disability management system standard from labor perspective. This webinar is co-hosted by CRWDP, CSA Group, and the Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance at Conestoga College's School of Business. Our panelists today will share labor perspective on the new Canadian work disability management system. I am honored to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. David Brown, Medical Director of CIBC, Alec Farquhar, the former Director of Office of Worker Advisor for Ontario's Ministry of Labour, and Tom McKenna, the National Health and Safety Representative of British Columbia's Regional Office at Canadian Union of Public Employees. We also have Lena Lopez, CSA Group's Project Manager for the development of CSA 1011 standard. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the views presented today are those of the panelists and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective organizations. In terms of format for today's webinar, we will begin today's webinar with a short presentation on CSA standard development process. For those that have been attending in our previous webinars, it will be very similar to what we had in the past. It will be a short 5-minute presentation by Lena. Then I will provide a high-level overview of this standard, and I focus on a labor perspective and how a labor perspective being seen in this standard. We have presented 4 questions to our panelists, and they will speak to these questions following my presentation. My presentation will take approximately 10 minutes. If you have any questions, please use the QA function of Zoom platform. Lena Lopez will make sure to capture all your questions, and we will get back to those questions at the end of the webinar. Lena, the floor is yours. I'll advance the slides for you. You're muted.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good day, depending where you're from. I'm going to take you through the CSA's standards development process. On the screen here, we have an overview of CSA's division. There's 2 areas of focus at CSA, which is the testing, inspection, certification, and the standards development process. And I'm going to be speaking to the standards development area. So next slide. The standards development process is involved with volunteers, and in the focus areas that CSA looks at are 12. So we have them here on the screen. I'm going to be speaking to narrowing on occupational health and safety, and that's where we're looking at advancing safety for workers and their well-being. You can go to the next slide. So here on the screen, there's highlighted the standard designation number and name. So it's Z1011 work disability management system, and it's part of the occupational health and safety management suite. It also weaves into worker wellness and these standards that are there. So we'll go into the next slide. On the screen here, we have the standards development process, the cycle. So it starts with either an individual or organization that comes forward and looking at an idea of how to standardize a process and how to make it safer in a particular area. It then works with committee members that are volunteered from various sectors to ensure that there's a balanced representation from different perspectives and groups and stakeholder groups. That committee there, those volunteers will work on the standard for approximately anywhere from 5 months to 11 months. And then once a draft standard is put together, it then goes out to public review for 60 days. That's where the public can review through the public review site that CSA has. It then comes back to the committee, taking into consideration the comments and questions that the public can have. The committee then looks at it, potentially revises the standard, as the draft, and then it goes into becoming a published standard. And then it holds for approximately 5 years as a maintenance. It's maintained. Public is allowed to ask questions, ask for interpretations, and the committee are actively looking at how to enhance it for the next edition. So we'll go to the next slide. Question we often get is a standard mandatory? Is it volunteer, or where does it stand, and why? And if it's a volunteer, should we even adopt it? So all standards at CSA are volunteer until they are referenced in legislation. And a lot of times, how does it get to that process? Well, it gets referenced, and reason why often is what I've highlighted here on the screen. It's a lot less expensive for the government to endure the process. The standard is developed through consensus, and it takes on perspectives of various stakeholder groups as well. It's continuously reviewed. Question on how to get involved. So the committee is considered of volunteers, and so there's an opportunity to participate on a committee. And then there's other ways as well that you can participate at the public review stage. So you can sign up to the public review on the public review site, follow occupational health and safety sector, and then you become advised and notified of any standards that are at that public review stage, as well as you can join the online community, pose questions, answer questions, as well as CSA has a research arm that looking at helping to inform standards through research. So there's an opportunity there to get involved as well. So I think that comes to the end, and that's over to you, Amin.
Thank you, Lena. That was very brief overview of this standard development process and how you can get involved. Thank you, Lena. Well, what I was going to actually share with you is some kind of a basic introduction to the standard needs and how workers are kind of incorporated, and workers' perspectives is incorporated into this standard. So let's kind of discuss what are we talking about when we are focusing on work disability management and trying to understand the magnitude of the problem, and also understand what is the status of work disability management in Canadian workplaces. The issue is around unemployment and underemployment of people with disabilities is a significant global issue, and that has enormous negative impact on the economy. In Canada alone, the recent estimate of the cost of the exclusion of people with disability identified a total burden at about $340 billion. That is about 7.5% of Canada's GDP. And looking at this from across all social domains, with the productivity and output cost of about $62 billion. So add to this the current trend in developed countries and the prevalence of chronic and episodic disabilities that is increasing with the aging of labor force. So we have to see what has been done to address this important issue. Have we been able to educate our decision makers, our employers, our managers, our supervisors with organizations, within organizations to understand and address this global issue? Despite, again, overwhelming amount of guidelines and best practices and research in this area, still we see that work disability management in many organizations is varied, is piecemealed, and often not based on organizational-wide approaches. Considering what it takes for organizations to implement an organizational-wide program to make a sustainable change, I think there is a need to incorporate best practice on work disability prevention and management into organizations' management system, and it becomes a part of a day-to-day operation within organizations. You could argue that's the case also for primary prevention activities, But when we're looking at work disability, we're looking at continuation of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And the reason that we believe that we can make an impact through that integration is that is the way to get employers and decision makers to recognize the importance of this issue by incorporating it to day-to-day business operation. It becomes a priority when it is linked to other business drivers. Looking at the complex work disability management process, we all acknowledge that employers are concerned about high level of absenteeism and presenteeism and turnover. There are also some confusion about the role that employers have in disability management and prevention, given the range of programs out there. On the other hand, we have laborers, we have labor worker representatives, union groups, that they are concerned about sustainability of employment of their members over a life course of workers, and the high unemployment levels of persons with disabilities that has significant socio-economical impact. And we're talking about issues from that workers face across the country and even around the globe. Add to this the complexity around disability support programs and service providers, that they're concerned with their own roles and lack of coordination across different experts and specialists. So we were looking at developing a standard that provides a platform for all these stakeholders to work together closely and promote a proactive approach towards work disability, highlighting the importance of the strategies that organizations may put in place to address the issues before the onset of work disability. This standard that was developed by a group of experts in this area include strategies to accommodate workers in order to prevent unnecessary absences or early and safe return to work. And focuses on, again, as I've highlighted earlier, a continuum from primary to secondary through to tertiary prevention, as this approach is known to be the most effective strategy. The standard frames also the work disability as a continuum in terms of managing worker health over the employment life cycle of individuals within organizations. Hence, what we did was we tried to work on the scope of this standard to provide a framework for managing work disability at the organizational level. It specifies the requirement for a work disability management process to support organizations, regardless of their size and sector. Again, the standard is scalable. You can implement it in medium to large to small businesses. Again, depends on how would you go about implementing an organizational-wide program. It has that flexibility that could help a wide range of employers across different sectors. As you can see in this slide, this standard has two main sections. One is the content, which outlines the requirements and also informative annexes, which are non-mandatory guideline material to further support organizations to implement this standard and better guide them to meet the requirements of this standard. The key requirements fit within the PDCA model of management system to allow seamless integration to existing organizational-wide models to address, other business challenges. And the key requirements focus on establishing a systematic approach towards work disability prevention and management, and helps and assist employers to implement a program based on their needs, based on the capacity, based on resources that they have, and based on limitations. So as I said, it's scalable. You can set your own targets and objectives. You can set your own timelines, but it provides that kind of a flexible framework to assure that organizations will be able to implement the program within their own boundaries. It highlights the role of senior management, worker and worker representatives, and other internal and external stakeholders that includes healthcare professionals and disability management services. We have some very important guiding principles outlined in this standard. The standard discusses the worker-centric approach as a dominant model to develop a proactive model for managing work disability. It also introduces an evidence-informed, data-driven approach that promotes accommodation and timely and safe return to work. It also discusses and outlines the role of key stakeholders and set a platform for promoting joint responsibility of several stakeholders within the organization, including, as I've said earlier, worker and worker representatives. And of course, similar to any other standards, it requires compliance with legal requirements and complying with legal requirements. One might ask where to start in the employment cycle. Is it the only accommodating workers that are injured, or only when you hire a person with disability? Well, the standard tries to highlight work disability management as a continuum in terms of managing worker health over the lifetime with the organization, from recruitment, hiring, and onboarding through to job continuity and advancement and eventual departure from the organization. One of the perhaps masterminds behind developing this kind of cycle and creating this kind of table you see here is David Brown, that is on the call today. But really, we were looking at providing guidance on what to look in each phase of the employment life cycle. Well, one of the other things that we've tried to make sure throughout the document is seen is around perspective of workers and how workers are expected to cooperate and to engage throughout different phases of implementation of this standard. Again, the standard highlights the joint responsibility of management, worker, and worker representatives throughout the process of implementing this standard. It highlights and has a lot of requirements around workers' right to privacy and confidentiality. Emphasizes a lot on worker participation and requires workers' participation and consultation throughout the process, and that could be done directly by engaging workers or worker representatives. Accommodate needs of workers as an essential aspect of this standard to be promoted as something that is the right of the worker, not as an add-on kind of concept. Effective, clear, and transparent communication is effective strategy to build and to improve organization culture around work disability management, and also understanding what is expected and what are the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders. In addition, needs of workers through stay at work and return to work process. Last but not least, the standard promotes an inclusive, non-judgmental environment towards workers with disability and highlights several ways that you can improve organization culture to promote this important aspect of organization's management system towards work disability. Well, that was, again, very quick snapshot of CSA 1011, a scope and a structure and some kind of perhaps ideas around workers' perspective that we've tried to consider throughout the development of this standard. And now let's meet with our panelists, who are actually the members of the technical committee that come up with this standard to present their views on the role of workers and discuss a labor perspective around work disability management system and standard. So we will start with Tom. We presented 4 questions to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to hear your perspective on this.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're calling from. If you can't hear me, just say, hey, Tom, speak a little bit louder. With respect with the implications of the work disability management standard for workers, I think the key thing is it is a worker-oriented, case-by-case approach. And this is really important for episodic disabilities and mental health-related disabilities, which we know are increasing. There's more and more evidence, especially due to the pandemic, that this is going to become another pandemic. This standard also provides an expansive definition of worker. It involves all key stakeholders, and it's a systematic organization-wide approach. I think this is really important because right now, in my experience, anecdotally, a lot of workers don't know how to coordinate or even are aware of the various benefits, entitlements, such as collective agreement entitlements, duty to accommodate, sick leave, private insurance, etc. Coordinating these can be especially challenging for people who are experiencing mental health issues. This standard helps employers, workers, and others to coordinate to bring all this in. I find personally for me, this is a very, very useful and important element to this. Again, as I've touched on previously, it addresses both the physical and mental health needs. It's a biopsychosocial approach, very important. And it promotes accommodation and early return to work. Did you want me to go through all 4 questions or just one at a time? I wasn't sure.
Feel free to to go through them in any order you would like, Tom.
Okay, I don't want to take all the time, so I'll try to be quick. As previously stated during the initial presentation, it reviews and addresses barriers. That's important, and it provides templates in the annex and information on how to do that. And it integrates other standards, such as the psychological standard. So this is not just a standalone standard, it links to many others. With respect to what we can do to support injured workers and a safe and timely return to work, identifying and reviewing the needs for accommodation. And you can do that by going through the templates and the materials in the annex. There's a lot of useful materials for employers, layperson friendly. You can walk through it. Assist with return to work planning, and assist with, most importantly for me, potential barriers, which may change. Many workers, in my experience, may have more than one disability or more than one health concern. So this standard will enable employers, workers, unions, and others to look at the situation, case-by-case basis, and figure out, okay, what does this worker need at this point in time? Diagnosis by diagnosis, recognizing a diagnosis may not be required. With respect to creative strategies, and I think this hasn't been touched on a lot because it's an evolving process. What can unions do to assist with workers and employers? COVID-19 taught us that no workplace is immune from the impacts of illness and disability. I think unions can approach and promote this model by implementing small case studies, analyzing data over a multi-year period, and encouraging sector groups or associations to take on case studies, because each sector may be a little bit different. They may have different needs, different requirements. Another thing, we need to promote restart programs, given the economy hopefully will be restarting after the pandemic. I think it's more important than ever to retain experienced, trained workers. This standard really promotes that. It helps with that. And my final 3 points are: lobby the federal government to reopen the National Workplace Accessibility Stream of Opportunities Fund for persons with disabilities. It concluded maybe jointly lobbying the government together, the federal government, to find more funding, support employers applying for provincial employment incentives, such as, for example, where I'm from, the BC Increased Employment Incentive. And finally, provincial opportunities funds programs such as the BC Opportunities Fund program. Again, going back to the very beginning, what I really like about this standard is how it takes a very wide net organic approach, a systems wide approach, and it can be customizable from a two-person employer, or literally 2 or 3 employees, up to very large employers with 4 or 5,000 workers, such as the city of Vancouver, other municipalities, Air Canada, whatever. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was perfect, and you kept it within the time, and I appreciate that you bring up that perspective around mental health and COVID-19, and I think these are very important perspectives. Our next panelist is Dr. David Brown from CIBC. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amin. I just need to be clear about some limitations here so that you can filter my comments through the right lens. And working with CIBC, I need to say that I have limited experience of working with organized labor. We have a couple of small parts of our business that are organized, so my experience is perhaps more with the general worker population. Actually, if you think of our 1,100 branches as small employers, of 15 to 25 people, sort of a smaller employer approach. And we also have a reasonable number of independent contractors in the mix as well. So I have a broader approach and light on the organized labor side. So, but, when we think about disability and where I get to on a face-to-face basis deal with it as opposed to the strategic level, I usually get to meet employees who, or workers rather, who have run into difficulty either through ill health or injury. Their capacity has in some way been modified. And we're sort of looking for the best way to accommodate. And sometimes I also get involved on the performance side of things, where it may be that it's a focus or a will or a capabilities issue that may be impacting the individual. And we're also looking for ways of trying to mitigate that as well in the most compassionate way possible. So. But regardless of how I get to meet you as an individual in this context at CIBC, the common theme that I run into is from people is associated with the disability is a degree of, from concern to fear. And quite often it's about the unknown. They feel that they're sliding into an abyss, and they really don't know the way forward. And so really what the standard does is it really offers an opportunity for a framework, so that people can move forward. And so knowing that everybody who's involved with the worker is playing along the same rules and has the same goal in mind, really simplifies things. And certainly from my perspective in working with the individual, I find this most important. Really, the implications though for workers really seem in my book to fall into sort of a clarity. We know where we're going, we know what the norms are, and we sort of know what the expectations of all of the various players are. And it's difficult enough, but that may be helpful. So I'm the least qualified to talk about what organized labor should do, but what I would suggest to organized labor is that the standard provides a very nice vehicle for labor to engage in a very supportive role, much the way as we do in health and safety. Quite often disabilities get misinterpreted. There are all sorts of issues. We often can end up in a difficult situation, but the standard actually provides a very nice framework, and it allows the union to change its perspective a little bit, and the same goes for the employers engaging the union. It provides the common framework. It's a two-way, fair process that's, shows the respect. And quite honestly, if you actually care about employees or workers, this provides a real win-win opportunity. And how you do that with your organized workers, it depends as much on the relationship you have with the organization as the nuts and bolts of how we get it on. But the standard provides a very nice vehicle. So really, to sum it all up, in my view, very simply, it looks at the interests of both parties. It provides a smooth and fair and integrated approach to dealing with disability. And I'm going to stop there and I'll let others speak.
Thank you, David. Very informative, I would say, perspective that I think really adds to today's discussion, and kind of seeing some questions that could possibly be very interesting around unionized versus non-unionized workplaces. Our next speaker is Alec Farquhar. Alec, the floor is yours. You're muted.
So hello, everyone. I appreciate so many people showing up for this part of our continuing series of launch, I guess, events for the Disability Management Standard. And also, I think you're seeing the kind of collaboration between employers and labor that has really marked the whole development of the standard, which is so important. So just before getting started, I want to remark on a really interesting event that happened in December. I approached Hassan Youssef, the head of the Canadian Labour Congress, and Perrin Beattie, the CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and asked whether they would consider doing a joint presentation at our Disability and Work conference on December 2nd about the need to ensure that persons with disabilities were not left behind in the gradual recovery of our economy from this terrible year that we've gone through together. They agreed, they did the fireside chat, and I think they modeled the kind of collaboration that can bring this standard alive in the workplace. So I'm going to build on what has been said by the two previous presenters and just sort of try to flesh it out a little bit more. First question is, what are the implications of a work disability management standard for workers? And I endorse everything that the two previous speakers have said. And I want to comment that in many workplaces, work disability management and prevention are not systematized. It's often seen as an HR issue handled by disability management specialists on a case-by-case basis. Especially in a unionized environment, I personally believe this can lead to a lot of unnecessary disputes, grievances, and litigation. And you can easily contribute to a poor labor relations environment overall if disability cases are seen as a sort of a source of litigation. You also sometimes get a defensive, technical, polarizing type approach versus a problem-solving approach. And this is because the worker may be disclosing a disability, they may see the employer as potentially hostile, the union is defending the member, and sometimes it can work out really, really well on a case-by-case basis, but as often as not, it doesn't. A standard provides all workplace parties and players with a framework for a more systemic approach. It can help you set benchmarks and make progress together. And I wanted to add to Tom's comment on the relationship between this standard and the other occupational health and safety standards. And I sit on the strategic steering committee for those standards. You'll often have a workplace, especially in the unionized sector, which has already implemented, for example, the health and safety management system standard, or perhaps the ergonomic or psychological health and safety standard. So they understand the framework, they understand how standards work, and it's sort of a natural segue to implement this one. And for some, this has advantages for their supply chain and their competitive advantage over employers who don't implement the standards. And that's because our standards are linked to the international standard world, and many of the advanced workplaces want to make sure their suppliers are part of that world, are adhering to those standards. So sometimes you can find yourself with a good advantage in the supply chain, and that's not a minor thing in today's tough competitive environment. The standard is also a resource to the workplace where you're not reinventing the process. And I see this so often in different workplaces that I keep wondering, after all these years, they're still sort of starting fresh with every case. It doesn't make sense. Second question is, what can union and labor groups do to support injured workers in their safe and timely return to work process? This partly depends on the employer. Ideally, the employer will recognize the union as a full partner in the process. And that means that the union's in on sort of the ground floor of figuring out the best way for injured and other disabled workers to return. So that's really the framework. And then within that framework, ideally, the union would help by working proactively with these individual situations. For me, the crucial aspect really in a lot of workplaces is trust. Does a worker trust that that employer will not penalize them and will welcome a disclosure of disability and then turn to a problem-solving approach? That's just vital. If fundamentally the worker feels they're not safe, they won't disclose when perhaps they're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse problem, or when they're struggling with a physical issue. They'll just suck it up and keep going. And by the time it emerges, it will be very late in the process and much harder to accommodate. Unions are often, I'd say usually, more trusted by workers than those workers may trust their own employer. That's just the nature of the bargaining unit situation. So sometimes a worker will disclose to a union before they disclose to their employer. And that can really open up constructive discussions where people feel safe, they talk it through with their union rep. That helps them frame a conversation with the employer where the worker feels more confident and the situation is more clear and clarified for the employer. Question 3 is, how can employers engage with unions, workers, and worker reps to implement an effective work disability management system? To me, this is new ground because our standard is new, but I'd advocate that employers take a really good look at engaging with the union fully around implementation of the standard. A place that a lot of workplaces have started that I feel has worked out quite well is to do a full documentation of the current state together. It can be an audit, a survey, a review, a situational assessment is what some people call it. But you're looking to figure out the key financial and non-financial costs to both parties and to the workers of the current state. What's your level of sick pay? What's your level of long-term disability? What proportion of your workers are at work, but really it's presenteeism? They're not functioning as fully as they could be. How many disability-related grievances do you have? What are they costing you? How do they play out? And are you doing employee surveys and finding that your employees don't trust you and that they're not engaged and not, in a sense, participating in problem solving of a general nature in the workplace? So an assessment like that can bring you up short because often the costs tend to be siloed and you don't realize the full cost of disability in the workplace. Then the process with the union around implementation can include reviewing the most vital elements of the standard, and that can vary depending on context. For example, some workplaces are already pretty good on improving a willingness to disclose a disability. There may be some level of trust, but maybe that same workplace, the frontline supervisors are not disability confident. They aren't well trained. They're perhaps even paralyzed or frightened they'll do something wrong. Not that they have a negative attitude, but perhaps dealing with someone with a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, a serious physical impairment, or a mental health issue, there may be a lack of confidence and therefore a lack of creativity and accommodation and a lack of flexibility. Now, in the most advanced situations, and I've been part of some of these, one that I recently participated in a presentation on is the Niagara Health System, a big hospital system in Ontario, where there are formal agreements involving 3 unions, the employer, around and this is pre-management standard, but around a joint accommodation and return to work system with a lot of joint training and a lot of joint implementation structures. That would be the ideal world, but at least doing chunks of it would be a pretty good start. I'll finish off with the creative strategies. I agree with everything the other speakers have said about this, and I'll just throw out some ideas. It really helps when the union can be funded to provide a specific representative in the workplace who can work on some elements of this, because unions will usually, from the dues money that they get, not have sufficient funds to take people off their job and let them do the hard work that sometimes needs to be done to get these systems going. So if you're in an intensive phase of getting this disability management standard implemented, and there's really significant need for workers to participate representing the union, let them have employer-funded payments, so they can put a month into it or 2 months into it, and you're not hampered by literally a lack of time by the union because they can't afford it. I also think it's valuable to partner on key training and awareness among workers. Often you can find common ground, and I've seen this happen again and again. For example, training around mental health issues, stress, work-life balance, substance abuse. And Tom mentioned something which I think is really important, and that's the impact of COVID-19 on all of these things. So sometimes when you do joint training of the supervisors and the key union reps, you build a common commitment to deal with these issues in a better way. It can have a huge impact, and I've seen it happen in a number of workplace settings. I'm a big advocate of linking this kind of disability management with prevention, primary prevention especially. So if you're an injured worker, in every case, analyze how did that worker get hurt? What can we do to improve health and safety? What can we do to improve health and safety and get that worker back to work so they're not afraid they'll get hurt again doing the same job in the same way? This helps the injured worker. It keeps the burden off the co-workers when that worker comes back, because they can do their old job with accommodation and better prevention measures. It helps those other workers from getting injured in the first place. And a really good example of this that I've seen in a number of workplaces would be joint ergonomics action teams, where you identify ergonomic issues, how to fix them, and make progress together. I also like the idea of creating data banks of accommodation and prevention solutions. And you can share solutions, especially with a union that has multiple locations. You can share them right across the sector, right across an occupation, and not be constantly reinventing the wheel for accommodation. Something else I've seen really more advanced workplaces do is they've linked with the healthcare providers to give them some idea of the nature of the jobs in the workplace, so you don't get these standard doctor letters describing very general types of limitations that have little relevance to what's really needed to understand what the worker can do of their old job. So sometimes the worker could be barred from returning to their former employment if only the doctor had known what limitations to look at. It could have worked out differently. And I'll finish off, and this really needs creative solutions, but I'll advocate it. Small and medium-sized workplaces don't feel they have the resources to implement the standard. It may even be a big issue to buy the standard, just the cost of that. And in some jurisdictions in the European Union and in Asia, governments will actually pay a lot of the cost for small and medium-sized businesses to adopt standards. And I personally think it's a good investment. So I'll end with that. And it sort of fits in with what Tom was saying about some of the government programs needing to come back and get more active. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alec. That was very interesting. And I really like your ideas about those creative strategies. And I'm sure that we're going to have some side conversations about those as well. I'll hand it over to Lena Lopez from CSA to moderate the QA session. Lena?
Thank you, Min. First question, I'm going to read it out, and any three of you are welcome to answer. Question from one of the attendees is, how does this model fit into the NIDMAR model, that is long-standing union/management model that is now recognized worldwide?
It's David. I would say that the NIDMAR model fits in very well with our standard. Our standard goes above and beyond what NIDMARS does. NIDMARS is very good. It's to do with disability management and return to work. But I think our standard is more encompassing than that. And so I would be very comfortable if I was following the NIDMAR processes. I would be very comfortable that I was meeting the standard, but just it's part of our standard as opposed to the reverse.
Can I add here as well, Lena? I think the standard really complements what NIDMAR has accomplished. NIDMAR's occupational standard, I think I would say, that looks into return to work specialists and so on, has a lot of good capabilities that again will help individuals implement their standard. And their standard focuses on creating a framework for organizations to implement a work disability management system process. So they're a little bit different in terms of the scope, but I think they complement each other very well.
Hi, Tom here. I totally agree with that. In fact, if you look at the examination guide for the NIDMAR materials, starting at page 9, you're going to see a lot of commonalities. Roles and functions of professionals involved in disability management. It goes to the employee, otherwise known as the worker, supervisors, the joint committee, etc. If you were to compare, as an example, the examination guide to our document here, you will see a tremendous amount of overlap. And more recently, if you go on the website, NIDMAR website, there's certification examinations being held later on this year with respect to mental health in the workplace. Again, a lot of overlap. When you look at the certificate program, including the examinations that will follow, item number 7 under module topics, strategies to retain workers experiencing mental health challenges, etc. If you break that down and go further into their documents, it's cut and paste right from the standard. There's a tremendous amount of overlap. And this is proof that this standard is more relevant than ever because this program is beginning. It's March 2021 all the way through to November 2021. So again, like these other speakers have mentioned already, it's timely, there's a lot of overlap, and I think they complement each other perfectly.
Yeah. Could I add something in?
Yes, go ahead, Alex.
So I'd also add a comment I made earlier. I just wanted to put it in this context. A real advantage of this standard is that it's integrated with the full suite of health and safety standards of CSA, and so it's part of the standards world in Canada. So that really helps with adoption. I think NIDMAR broke tremendously important ground in the past couple of decades, and I think what's happening now with this standard shows how it's much more mainstream. So many more people are interested in these concepts, and I do appreciate all the work they've done.
Thank you. We have another question here in regards to unions. What are unions doing to engage with employers to address COVID mental health related disabilities?
I can answer that. It depends on the union, it depends on the province and the jurisdiction. In CUPE, in BC, for example, we are putting on courses. There will be a course for CUPE members coming up in the next few weeks on the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on mental health. Secondly, we are researching and gathering data on what is the impact on CUPE members, but not as a labor movement as a whole, with respect to mental health and COVID-19. We, as I mentioned earlier on, keep on hearing and reading that there will be another pandemic of mental health issues. So we're trying to prepare and brace ourselves for that. At the national level, our organization is actually creating documents, which will be coming out in the next few months, on mental health in the workplace. There are certification and training programs that are going on in the next 2 weeks for some of our health and safety staff with respect to mental health in the workplace.
Thank you very much there. See if anyone wanted to add anything else to it. Just looking at the time, there's one more question here, and I'll just finish off with this last question. Are employers, specifically those that are not unionized, receptive of the standard? How about unionized organizations?
I can only speak to unionized organizations. I've had tremendous support from my own organization, nationally and provincially. We recognize that disability as an evolving concept, especially episodic disabilities and mental health, are huge concerns, both for unionized and non-unionized workers. And given the ever-increasing numbers as related to the pandemic, these need to be addressed.
Maybe I could add something, Lena?
Yes, go ahead, Alec.
So this is just an observation. I'd love to know what the uptake is, but here's just a general observation. We were working away, developing this standard and finished it. And of course, it's been tremendously affected by the COVID situation. And I haven't checked lately in terms of the uptake, but my guess would be that most employers have been just struggling to stay afloat, struggling to get through this time, just the same as unions have been. And probably the uptake hasn't been what it could have been if we hadn't had that. So I'm really hoping that these sessions that we're having here and the timing of them, that it's almost like we need a little bit of a relaunch to remind people the standard is there and see what a role it can play in the return to work. And I do want to comment that CSA has sponsored a really interesting project that I'm also part of, which is about the return to work from COVID. And so there may be some opportunities, almost like a reset button. I'd be interested in knowing what David or Tom have to say about this. Part of recovering is that we'll need a framework for all these folks. And Tom, I mean, really, it's a potential pandemic of the long haulers, the physical aspects combined with the stresses and strains that are just already emerging and I think will get worse. So a framework could really help. And I think there may be a need to re-engage a little bit and almost like a relaunch. I'm just throwing that idea out, but I think it might match the circumstances.
I completely agree with you. You could be sitting right next to me right now. This pandemic has created challenges and opportunities, and I think it's an amazing opportunity as a 2.0 for this standard. Secondly, the data that we're getting in BC from two different institutions, Vancouver General Hospital and Surrey, are that what's called long hauler syndrome, it's the post-COVID-19 syndrome, up to 30% of people who've had COVID and who are symptomatic may experience long-term or possibly permanent symptoms. So this the standard meshes perfectly with that. And I echo your comments completely. Absolutely.
Thank you. No more questions. I'll turn it over to you, Eamon.
Thank you, Lena. Today's webinar was the last webinar hosted by us on this topic at CSWP. We did a series of webinars. We did the launch webinar, the one including insurance providers perspective, the healthcare perspective that is not presented in this graph, a webinar presenting perspectives of persons with disabilities, employers' perspective, and a webinar focused on mental health, which I believe completed a range of topics, a range of issues for disability management. And I would like to thank everyone that helped us to go through these webinars and really engage with our audience about this topic. There are two other webinars related to this topic that will be hosted by our partner, CRWP. One on looking at labor perspective, again, another one on this labor perspective topic, as well as another webinar by them on the role of healthcare and disability management services. We have other webinars hosted by CSWP on different topics. One on the strategies and tools to estimate physical exposure in the workplace. On May 10th, we are going to have a webinar on addressing post-traumatic stress injuries among Canadian paramedics. We're going to also launch a webinar series on work from home and its impact on physical and mental health of Canadians, as well as the impact on performance and productivity. We launched a national survey on work from home and its impact on physical and mental health, and we will soon release the initial findings of that national survey. And those webinars will be looking at the data that we gathered and the information around possible strategies to address work from home issues. The recordings of all our webinars, including the webinar today, is available through our website, through our YouTube channel and our website. Please feel free to share the link with your network. At the end, I would like to thank our panelists. I'm very grateful for our panelists and that they generously volunteered their time and committed to support our webinar series. On a personal note, I would like to thank Alec Farquhar and Dr. David Brown for their support from the very beginning, when it was, I believe, in 2014 that I approached them with this idea. And since then, they've been as supportive as ever to help get where we are right now. Again, I really appreciate your mentorship, your support through these many years. I would like to also thank Lena Lopez and the CSA group for their support for this webinar series on work disability management. At the end, I would thank to our audience that take time to attend our webinar series and support our webinar series. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in our next webinar. Thank you.